spoken about the downtrodden and the poor who can be channelized to conservation. But we have completely avoided the fact that there is another class called the middle class who are knowledgeable as well as arrogant. We drive in cars, but we do not know the difference between wet waste and dry waste. So how do you think, what is the best possible way to mobilize this particular group of people towards conservation? Because as we know that using plastic bags in markets, then throwing it off on the road, which means that the sewerage system is not, it's plugged and it flows down to the river water, which leads to pollution. So how do you think is the best possible way to mobilize this particular group?
Praveen, very interesting question. You have people at the cutting edge who are worried about conservation because it affects their livelihoods. You have people at the very top worried about global issues, conservation. But you have this consumerist consumption class, an expanding class, which doesn't seem to be bothered about conservation. How do you address that issue? The question that she's raised.
It's not my domain at all, because I don't work on any of the...
No, therefore, it makes you an expert on that. So make you one answer. So address that issue.
All I can tell you is that many of us in this room are all middle-class activists who have put in a huge amount of work to sensitize people, to go out and reach out to people, not necessarily in the urban environment issue that you raised, but in other aspects. So therefore, there is a growing participation of people in this process. It's not enough, but there is a growing effort, or rather there's a growing participation. The effort needs to be multiplied many, many folds.
Mahesh, is the middle classization of India anti-conservation?
Not necessarily. Historically, the middle classes many members of the middle classes who raised larger issues of social reform were at the forefront with issues which we would today see as conservation. Bahram Shah Malabari, who was beaten up in public for supporting the age of consent bill, was one of the first persons to criticize weekend mass hunting of wild birds by people going out from Bombay. The Bombay Natural History Society, if you look at its roll call, included a lot of middle-class people, one of whom was Salim Ali's ancestors. And I think this remains true till this day. What I would add, madam, when we think of the middle class, we shouldn't necessarily conflate it with the English speaking. One big transformation, particularly over the last 20 years, in which there has been, there's been the role of the media, the role of markets, there is a very large, flourishing middle class, which deeply is evocative about nature and environmental issues in their own languages. And I don't think this has entirely been negative. So whether it is, the Gir Lion of Gujarat or the rhinoceros in Assam or, the very important movements in Sikkim on certain dams, it's the middle classes locally who've been active. And when I say middle class, I'll put, the school teacher. They were at the forefront of, say, the Silent Valley movement. Our problem is slightly different, and it involves all of us. The marvelous book called Driven Wild, Paul Sutter talked about the wilderness movement in America, and all the guys working for the movement, they succeeded. They got a lot of were people who drove there on weekends. So, often, and this is true of middle classes the world over, we are very aware of nature for consumption, but we rarely think about how can we reduce our ecological footprint. There we're on fascinating ground. We can avoid a lot of the awful things done in other countries.
Okay. Next question. Yes, ma'am.
Perhaps, given my age, I can also call it despair. But given the wealth of information we have, the concerned citizenry, I would think that we should have no problems. And then you look at the policies of the last few months, or perhaps even few years. Do you really think, any of you, that all this is going to add up to change? Is anybody who's making the policies willing to listen, or have we lost the battle already?
So are you optimistic or pessimistic, Praveen?
I'm cautiously optimistic. For the simple reason that
cautiously optimistic.
There is a
Very good.
strong background, foundation on which all this is built up. Overnight, and the way, as I understand our country functions, overnight somebody can't dismantle it in just one shot. So certainly there are going to be new challenges. Certainly there are going to be issues that are going to affect us every day. But I think at a certain point, we are going to, the government has to see reason. Because as somebody said, there's an enlightened middle class. There are issues that are being raised. There's an active media. There's a very active judiciary. So therefore, I don't think you should despair. I don't think you should.
Okay. Your question reminds me of the old, what is the difference between an optimist and a pessimist? A pessimist says, I can't imagine a situation worse than today. And the optimist says, I can. So we may not have reached the bottom as far as...
I'll just illustrate in 1 minute, just 1 minute. When Ulas was saying this, when he first started going to Nagarhole, and when I started going to Nagarhole in the 80s, we were not seeing animals. So there was despair. But then today if you go there, it's one of the strongholds of, it may be an isolated example. I'm not saying that across the country tigers may have retreated. But the point remains that wherever public have been vigilant, people have participated in the process, there have been recoveries. And these recoveries are going to happen, notwithstanding the kind of pressures that are building.
I think we are wind up. We've already got a signal that we have exceeded our time.
Can I go for it?
Oh. I think we are... Absolute guillotine? Okay, it's an absolute guillotine. I'm sorry, all the questions that couldn't be asked could certainly be asked bilaterally once we get out. We've had a very enriching discussion amongst three very distinguished scholars, activists on the conservation front. I just want to just summarize by saying that rapid growth is on the nation's agenda, very much. And as Praveen said, over the last 15, 20 years, India's annual average rate of GDP growth has been 7.3%, which means that GDP has doubled in 10 years' time. So it's a great achievement. And we need to increase economic growth further because no country in the world adds 10 million to its labor force every year. The sheer demographic challenge in India. We are 1.25 billion today. And our demographic karma is we're going to add 400 million people in the next 35 years. Most countries are going to face demographic decline. China is going to add only 25 million in the next 35 years. And in 35 years' time, we will be the world's most populous country, irrespective of what we do today. I mean, that's a given. So the demographics is staggering. And without economic growth, you're not going to be able to meet the infrastructure needs, the employment needs, the aspirations of a growing population. So rapid growth is a given. But that growth has also to be inclusive because you cannot have inequality increasing. In the last 20 years, we've had rapid growth, but we've also had increasing. In fact, the paradox of India in the last 20 years, growth has been higher, poverty has been lower, but inequality has been higher. So we got increasing inequality. So you've got to make growth inclusive so that more and more people benefit from that growth. But there is a third component to this growth, that rapid growth, inclusive growth, and sustainable growth. Because if it is not sustainable, it's not going to be inclusive. What is growth? If you're going to contaminate your water, pollute your water resources today, and impose an enormous public health cost on the population, not only today, but of populations to come. And there is already increasing evidence of this, that air pollution, water pollution, chemical contamination has all contributed to a deterioration in public health. So rapid growth, inclusive growth, and sustainable growth have to be the three pillars of our growth strategy. I share your concern, madam, that we talk of rapid growth nowadays, we talk of inclusive growth nowadays, but somehow the talk of sustainable growth is now being edged out of the public discourse. And I think the challenge for all of us, scholars, activists, politicians, is how do we restore the primacy of sustainability to our growth process. It's not a luxury. Sustainability is absolutely essential for us to ensure equity of the growth that we want. So I think all of us today here are basically people who would like to see growth, who would like to see equitable growth, benefits of growth shared by all sections of society. But for that to happen, our water must be protected, our air must be protected, our mountains have to be protected, our rivers have to be protected, our natural resources have to be used in a manner that ensures that livelihood security is not disturbed. I mean, that's the big, big question for us. And I think no country in the world faces this challenge the way we do. No solution is available in the world today because of the sheer demographic pressures that we face. And also the unique nature of the fact that most of our natural resources, which is required for fueling this rapid growth, is in our forest areas. No other country in the world has this dilemma, of having all the coal and the iron ore and the bauxite in forest areas. So I think the next few months is going to be crucial. Going to be how much of this is going to change. We have a very progressive edifice of sustainability. Our laws are very progressive. And we should never forget the historical context of these laws. The Forest Conservation Act came about in 1980 because of a growing concern that India was facing rapid deforestation. It was not Indira Gandhi's Midsummer Night's Dream to have a Forest Conservation Act. Similarly, people forget that the Environment Protection Act in 1986 became a reality because of humanity's worst industrial disaster of Bhopal in December of 1984. It was that single event that catalyzed the Environment Protection Act of 1986. Similarly, the Forest Rights Act of 2006 has a very strong social and historical background of the growth of Maoist violence in forest areas, in tribal areas, in mineral-rich areas. And that's why the Forest Rights Act became a reality. So one should divorce laws from their historical context, which very often we tend to do in the media and in the public discourse. So I am cautiously optimistic. I share his cautious optimism because I think we have a very large constituency of people in this country at various levels concerned about these issues. The growth at all costs constituency is certainly politically very influential, but I'm sure that there are many others who would moderate this enthusiasm of the growth at all costs constituency. And I think the debate we have had this evening is a contribution towards that feeling, towards that sentiment. I thank all of you for being here. I apologize to all those who raised their hands. We couldn't accommodate all the questions. I congratulate Mahesh Rangarajan once again for receiving this award. I thank Praveen Bhargav and Vidya Atreya for being here and being subject to moments of Arnab Goswami, if not a long period. I thank Dr. Bawa, Dr. Khoshoo's, the young Dr. Khoshoo, who's very much here and who has helped to keep the memory of his great father, an outstanding scientist and one of the real founders of the Ministry of Environment. Thank you all. Thank you, Mahesh. Thank you.
Excuse me, we are not finished yet. Please be seated. Thank you.
Day. It started with several hours with Mr. Ramesh, and there was one key takeaway we got in the morning after 3 hours of debate and discussion is the confluence of science and humanity. Key takeaway. From the spirited debate, I take one key takeaway home in my mind. It's right versus right. One of you said this. That's the debate. Both sides of the argument are right. So with that, thank you so very much for coming here. The spirited discussion here, it was really enjoyable. Please join us for tea outside. And I'm sure you guys will get tons and tons of questions. And again, on behalf of Atri and the Khoshoo family, thank you very much.